Everyone, Christopher Bakken here. Really pleased that LSU Press is hosting me for a live book release here on Facebook. A quick word of thanks before we jump in. First of all, I can't say how happy I am to be working with LSU Press. Every single correspondence has been professional and wonderful. James Long is complete pro. Corey Calabria, thanks for hosting me today, and to the whole team at LSU. Thanks for making this book. Here it is. I don't know if you can see it with all the glare. My camera is going to do funky things here. This is Driving the Beast, just came out in December. And I'm going to take this opportunity today to introduce you to the book, try to describe a few of the book's preoccupations, and then I'm going to read some poems to you. There are two sort of entry points that I think I can use to help you understand how the book opens and then what it's trying to do after that. And the first is the book's epigraph from Pausanias, and the second is the first poem, Invocation. And so let me talk about these two quickly. Pausanias, if you don't know, was a kind of ancient tour guide, his guide to Greece. He wandered around the ancient world looking at stuff and offering us the most incredible comments about those things. He has a very odd moment, and when I found it in Pausanias, it struck me, where he's leaving a temple, and he describes the following. As you go out of the temple, there's a mirror fitted into the wall. If anyone looks into this mirror, he will see himself very dimly indeed, or not at all. But the actual images of the gods and the throne can be seen quite clearly. Now, I don't think Pausanias meant this exactly, but for me, I was really struck by the idea that the gods and the throne obscured our image and clarified their own. I was thinking, I think when I read the epigraph, how religion and politics have combined in this country and in many places in the world in ways that have distorted the very image or the idea of what the United States is, in such a way that we struggle to see our own selves or our own place in it. And so it introduces this epigraph, this idea of reflection, where we see our own image and we might even like what we see, or we might be horrified, but also refraction, where our attempts to see the world reflected back to us are somehow obscured. One of the great obscuring moments of the recent years, of course, was the great period of isolation all of us endured during the pandemic. And this poem, Invocation, the first poem in the book, speaks to that in some ways. In this poem, we are also leaving an enclosure. It's not a temple, but it's our houses, trying to see how the world might look again. Traditionally, an invocation is a poet's attempt to ask the divine muses for permission to sing of things the poet has no access to. But in this case, I think I'm requesting from the muse permission or the ability to sing a kind of stinky, earthly, beastly music instead. Here's Invocation. Sing in me a dithyramb to salt, epics of cardamom and sage. Cypress trees grow taller, please. Snails, commence your racing. Let us stoke delicious bonfires and jig unbridled every night on the opium sands of Dahab. Let the cats of Sinai have their fish. May scorpions find their blue shadows. May the owls of blasphemy roost. Hymn for the pelvis, hymn for the brow, hymn for the nobility of bread. Loose royal parrots from your cages, loose weeping peacocks to the trees. Sing in me of tomorrow's flung doors. Sing as we depart small houses at last. And so we begin. I'm going to read a sampling of poems from the book now, beginning with the title poem. And when I was thinking about how to organize this in a way that might make some sense, I went back to that trope of the mirror, reflection, refraction, to help navigate the book's various tensions and introduce its threads. And so you might not see the word mirror appear in every poem? It will be in some, but that idea can stay in the back of your minds a little bit as I read. Let's begin on the island of Thasos with the title poem, Driving the Beast. Um, I'm on a mountain with a friend. We are looking for the beast, a ram. The poem enacts a kind of ritual sacrifice, and it won't take long, I think, for you to understand that in some ways, the self is the beast, driving the beast. In the thick brush, they spend the hottest part of the day soaking their hooves in the trickle of mountain water the ravine hoards on behalf of the oleander. You slung your gun across your back in order to heave a huge gray stone over the edge, so it rolled, then leaped and crashed below. This is what it took to break the shade, to drive the beast, not to mention a thrumming of wings into the sky, a wild confetti of frantic grouse. But we had slugs not shot, and weren't after their small meat, but the huge rams, whose rack you'd seen last spring, and whose stench now parted air, that scat-caked, rut-ripe perfume of beast. Watch, now he runs, you said, launching another boulder. Then out it sprang, through a gap in some pine, brown and black, with spiraled horns, impossibly agile for its size. But yes, he fell, with one shot. Already an idea of meat for fire by the time we'd scrambled through the scree. And that was all. No, you were careful, even tender with the knife work, slitting the body wide with one stroke, then with your hands lifting entire the miraculous liver and heart, emptying the beast on the mountain. Later it rained, knocking dust off the patio stones. Small frogs returned from abroad to sing in the stream beds. We sat and drank. The beast talked to its rope in the tree. At last you spoke. No more, you said. Enough with mourning. Then rose to turn our guts, already searing on the fire. That poem was originally published by the Academy of American Poets, but strangely enough, it was picked up for republication by a hunting magazine. It's the only poem I can claim where that's ever happened. Um, One of the other things that holds this book together is the idea of theology. The word theology appears in about a third of the poems. And these are rather unorthodox attempts at seeking, at prayer and belief. Each one of these theologies tries to ponder what the sacred might look like or might feel like in a particular location or particular circumstance or to a particular non-human beast. And so there's a little bit of a bestiary running through the book as well. Um, the book also moves back and forth between Wisconsin and Greece, the two landscapes of my imagination. We'll get to Greece in a moment, but this is the first time in my career that I've really written much about my boyhood in Wisconsin, and so the first of these theologies is set there. I'll tell you very quickly, I grew up in the town of Martinsville, Wisconsin, outside of Madison, population 80, about four different German last names populated the town, most of them Catholic. We were the Lutheran family in the ranch style home at the edge of town, radicals. And as I think back to this mythic time, childhood is mythic time for all of us, I especially think with some fascination, but also shame about the violent masculinity that ruined a lot of the people in that town, and that also I think informed my own understanding of myself then. This is called Hive Theology, and the poem owes something of a debt to Seamus Heaney's great poem, Death of a Naturalist. Not water, so much as bloomed over slime to be gashed with a chucked stick. The algae there was thick as evil jam. Then on a low bough, a house to bring down. For an hour I lived the hive with stones, speared it twice to poke out eyes, till a beard of wasps swelled from its cheeks. I even ran up and spat at it twice. If you wanted to know such greatness now, you'd have to take my meanness, too. It was vast. Fools like me were easy enough to find if you needed someone to detest beyond your father or the church. Runoff from the slaughterhouse would seep down here where cows used to graze, soured this stagnant pit to a useless mirror. It's hard to drown on purpose in a pond, Richard Pertzborn said, and he might know. The wasps led me there anyway, intent on testing the sting of my madness. I had a spite reserved for me by me, a bloody urge that welled behind my eyes, that made me slam my torso into walls and drove me to woods to roil a swarm. So I taunted those gods, begged the sludge to take me in, all of my sick, sick blood, and the terrified freight of my body, anything in me worthy of mud. Oh, to be open to hurt like that. Here's a mirror poem from Greece, a place I moved to in my early 20s, a place that has utterly colonized my imagination and my life. I'm not a drop, I don't have a drop of Greek blood, so none of this makes a lot of sense. I think of myself as a Hellenized barbarian and a Philhellen, and I'm happy to wear those tags. This poem is called The Crossing, and it's set in two mirrored places. The poem is also in two sections. The first section is called Lesvos. The second section is called Assos. Let me introduce you briefly to these two locations. Assos is a small coastal town in Turkey, not far from Troy, actually. There's a beautiful temple to Athena up on the parapets above the town. And Assos looks directly across a heroic strait of water to the island of Lesvos, in fact, to the town of Molivos. Um, though this is a very famous piece of water, lots of sailing, people like Odysseus coming on through. In the last decades, it's become a scene of great humanitarian catastrophe. Human beings struggling to escape places like Syria are on the move, attempting to reach the refuge of Europe. And on the Turkish coast at Assos, they board flimsy rafts brokered for them by bad people. And they try to make it across, and many, many, many of them end up drowning. In fact, just today, another such catastrophe in Greece. This poem's called The Crossing. Lesvos. Fishermen out before dawn. None returned. I asked you why they left their nets behind, but you were looking out across to Assos and maybe didn't hear me in the wind. We both wore the same ironic mask, one blue eye floating upon a white sea. On that balcony, beside the iron table, a geranium held on for dear life. All day, we watched waves capsize in the rain. Our shoreline here, the other shoreline's mirror. Those aren't nets, you said after a long time, but mounds of sodden jackets and lost oars. Stray cats sheltered in the light of the cafe, we didn't know the others huddled there. The wind changed course and tried to explain by shaking the geranium, but words sank in the crossing, so we heard under water. When I opened my hands, my palms burned, as if they'd been lashed by splintered wood. In sleep, you told me, we have been rowing. Truth is, no one here knows where we're going. I begged you not to leave, but you'd already slung an orange scarf over your wet head. There aren't enough boats to carry them, I shouted, so there's nothing left to do. There is, you said. I'm going down to sea. And this is 2, Assos. They would rise the islands, enormous beasts, somehow moving faster than our ship. They hid their faces from us, but their backs, covered in a coarse fur of thorn bushes and clots of purpling thyme, would seem to heave as they swam, pull us to their shores. These were not the Ithacas we wanted. Yet each morning we docked for a while, if we found a harbor, so some of us could be discarded. We watched ourselves dissolve to distance in the ship's arrowing wake. Lines of us trudging up island spines in search of water or sheltering caves. So we grew lighter, every day riding higher on the waves, and we had more time. In the galley, we feasted on our grief. We'd spent all our lives by then, had nothing left to decide beyond which one of us, last hero bound for home, would steer the empty ship. One of the poems I will not read today because it would take up the majority of our time, but I wanted to make mention of it, um, is a poem that also thinks about our failure to act humanely and compassionately. But this poem is set in the United States. It's called For the Dead Union. Um, the poem begins in the Greendale Cemetery in the small Pennsylvania town where I live. I'm out foraging mushrooms, and I begin excavating and thinking through the history of Meadville, Pennsylvania, a great blue-collar American town that, in the last years, has become infected or maybe reinfected um, by a kind of violent white nationalism. The source of that reinfection, I probably don't need to explain to you. Um, some years ago, I was teaching For the Union Dead by Robert Lowell, and one of my students in an essay referred to it as For the Dead Union. I thought that was a wonderful mistake and thought I should write a poem with that title. Um, uh, the um, the poem itself weaves in a lot of Lowell and thinks hard about what it means to live in this country now. But as I said, I'm not going to read it. I just thought I'd make mention of it. It takes up a big portion of the first section of this book, and you should buy the book and check it out. That's what I think. Let me read another couple of these theology poems. Here are a few beasts for you. This is a short one. Um, in my summers in Greece, I spent a lot of time underwater, diving and hunting for octopus, and have become less interested in eating them and more interested in just studying them and hanging out with them. You won't be surprised, or maybe you should be, that this poem has 8 lines and 8 syllables per line. Octopus theology. To no pain, I ate my own leg. This is a way of suffering. I tunnel into my darkness, a cave of ink, then become one in a ring of unburied stones. So I attend, God of stillness. Permit me my devouring. From each stump, another leg grows. Let me read one short theology. This is called Owl Theology. I'll do 2 more theology poems and then end with a different one. Owl Theology. I sat alone with the God, looking up, blank shape through an aperture of branches, the morning wide with questions. Who painted the leaves of the orange tree green? Left so much work unsigned, if barely framed, by the horizon's embracing wings. Who offered me this bundle of bones? My bones, said the God. My God, said the bones. On and on like that for many hours of pure confusion, too holy for song. Steady on a dead limb, listening. Knowledge better taken in pieces, talon cleaved, then prized to ribbons slowly, on past the ribs to the jeweled interior. Uh, I come from a long line of deer killers from the state of Wisconsin, and am surely in the history of my family the single worst deer hunter ever to be named Bakken. This poem is called Whitetail Theology. You will understand why I was such a terrible deer hunter as I read this poem to you. It's also a poem about the way that sons mirror their fathers and fathers mirror their sons. My dad is what struggled for many years with substance abuse and addiction to prescription drugs, and that comes up in the poem as well. Whitetail Theology. In late October, early in the rut, I'd heave up to the higher branches and wedge myself between two wings of oak, then grip my bow, try hard to stay still. Nothing made that easy. Neither the cold nor the stampede of raw desires that threatened to trample my boredom. What made it worse were the ghosts who'd hunted here before, the family line, generations who'd stalked these woods, its granite pinnacle, looking for deer. How little I cared about shooting them. Well before dusk, my father would leave to stomp a 3-mile arc behind the wind, forgetting his damaged hip, and for now, even the brown bottles of pills he racked like ammunition in the black lunch pail he hid beneath a blanket in his car. Instead, he'd steer the deer from their grass along the muddy banks of Blue Mounds Creek, then run them up through scrub to where I sat. The shame he carried, I could not forgive. And yet, after those hard hours of hiking, when he'd find doe or even a spike buck, pulling clover right under my tree, and I wasn't asleep, but reading a book, he'd say nothing. We were not eloquent like that, not with our disappointments. The deer would raise tail and run, we'd drive home. As the Greek myths go, there are few good fathers. Sons are abandoned on barren hillsides, left to starve. Others are simply devoured, gore for the monsters who engendered them. And Zeus, a flagrant serial sadist. At best, men are titans for a few hours, small gods who stride beside the ancestors to lift us while they can from chariots into bed, setting all our weapons aside. And though he must have held him in his arms, that boy who lost his wings, the boy who fell, not even poor Daedalus could save his son. No wonder I could not save my father. I mentioned before the book is divided into two sort of mirroring parts. I want to read for my last poem, one of the poems from the second half of the book, a poem in which the Greek mirror and the Wisconsin mirror actually kind of collapse into one another. You'll understand what's happening. So turning 50 is ominous, and to mark an occasion of being a half century old, I decided to go to a very ominous place called the Oracle of Death on the Mani Peninsula, a place celebrated by the great writer Patrick Leigh Fermor, who swam into the entrance of Hades there. I thought I could go by foot. As it turns out, that wasn't going to work. I had been following the directions in The Golden Ass by Apelius. And so in the poem, some of those directions are woven into the poem in italics, which you won't see. But here is Turning 50 at the Oracle of Death. A few wrong turns brought me here to the end. So far south, the land ran out of itself, open sea devouring all but this slab of dusty headland inscribed by high wind. I obeyed the ancient instructions, left my rented car behind, and went by foot to find the cave, the drawing place of ghosts, ventilation shaft of the underworld. Here the living came to sip at death. Would I even know which questions to ask? Half a century old, and I was still a ruin addict, clomping haunted sites in my flip-flops, hoping to rouse the mind with a whiff of information and myth in between long swims and cold seaside beers. I never liked to predict my next move. Yet for this cheerful destination, I'd read a book, even opened a map. In fact, prediction was what drew me here. Looking out for death, listening at least for its mute, insistent murmur, was what I had been doing every day since, as a boy, I learned I had to die. When you come to the oracle of death, push your head through, find a road going down that no one travels. That same road led into a labyrinth of storm drains I discovered when I was 10 beneath the streets of Madison, Wisconsin. Those crumbling tunnels were ankle deep with rainwater and rills of fallen leaves. I lost myself down there, and yet emerged from a manhole 5 blocks from home. I'd followed where the unlit current led. 50 now, why not get lost again? I trudged the sweltering peninsula, but found only old walls, a broken church. The famous cave, I learned, was further out. You had to go by boat and then dive in. So many years spent tunneling back into passages I wouldn't remember. Every hour sacred, but rigged for collapse. Burial rites, we rehearse each birthday. Which is to say there's really no way back, and this far south, left and right are the same. Anyway, the afternoon was dying. The map of the Mani I'd unfolded was still there in my car to be ignored. The end of one continent at my feet. Nothing to do now but turn north and walk. Thank you very much for being here. Happy to answer questions if you have them.
Christopher, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I really love that last poem you read. I
Thank
think
you.
that was great to end on. And congratulations on your new book.
Thanks.
Um, I also wanted to thank everyone for tuning in the chat. I want to do some shout outs here, in part to help Christopher feel like he's a part of this room that we're all a part of, because he can't see what we're all seeing. So I'm gonna shout out some names here, and Christopher, I hope that you can help me with some of the Greek pronunciations if
I
you
will do
don't
my
mind. I
best.
might be struggling with them, but I want to shout out Dan Albergati, who's tuning in from Tampa. Alan
Nice.
Michael Parker from Davidson, North Carolina. We got Cheryl
Woohoo.
Tornsey in Philly. We've
Nice.
got Catherine Strzyk, and I had to look this up. Is it Gloucester? Is that right? Is that how you say it? I'm too Southern to know how to pronounce it, I think. Massachusetts. Thank you, Jeannie, for tuning in. Jeannie Parzaconis from Florida. And then I think we also have Tommy Michalopoulos, something like
Mikalopoulos. Yeah,
Michalopoulos
Mikalopoulos.
from
Hmm.
Fredericton, New Brunswick. So thank you all so much for tuning in. And this is a Q&A portion. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I'm going to be looking at the chat as I'm asking Christopher questions. So, um, yeah, I'm going to actually start with a fun question from
Great.
Rashed Chowdhury. There's a lot of comments. Sorry, I'm just kind of going through them here.
Okay.
Rashed, who I believe is tuning in from Toronto. So welcome, Rashed.
We got
And
a
he
Canadian
asks,
here. I love
we
it.
have a Canadian here. We have two, because we have someone else tuning in from New Brunswick. Well, is New Brunswick? Wait, is that? I'm being silly. Okay.
Tommy's in Canada. Yeah.
Okay. Um, So Rashid asks, as far as you know, are you the only person in literary history to have juxtaposed Greece and Wisconsin in poetry?
Um, I'm just going to say yes, because I can't think of another example. I'm positive I'm probably not, but in poetry, maybe, which does go to the very strangeness of my own existence. How does a hockey playing hick from Wisconsin end up with a life that's been so deeply informed by a place that has nothing to do with his heritage or upbringing? Lucky me. So
On
yes, thank you. I get to claim this as my one unique thing, perhaps.
On that note,
Mhm.
we have a question from Dan that I wanted to read. He congratulates you on your new book, and Dan asks, "What first drew a barbarian like you to Greece in your 20s?"
Wow. By the way, if you don't know Dan's book, Candy, it was I think it was the very first Siwani poetry selection from LSU Press. So you should buy that book and my book at the same time. It's a wonderful book, and Dan's a great poet. So Dan, thanks for the question. Um, what drew a barbarian to Greece? Well, it was the originally the allure of paying off some graduate student loans by teaching English. As it turns out, I speak English, and that was a pretty valuable commodity. Um, to be honest, I applied to, I think, 30 small schools scattered across the globe. They all had one thing in common. They were near beautiful water and the equator. But I did pepper Greece because I had a real interest in going there, but just got a job offer. And so, in the space of a weekend, moved home from New York City, dumped my stuff in a garage, and was living in Thessaloniki, Greece a week later. So I just landed. It was really chance that brought me there. And of course, the interest in the place and its poetry. But I had no idea that when I took this job teaching in Greece, that it would sort of color and shade every facet of my life from that moment on. Um, so my honest answer, money, and not much of it. Um, but the opportunity to live on the side of a mountain in Greece's second largest city, and to read Greek poetry there, and to ride my motorcycle around and going to strange places like the Oracle of Death. Glad it happened to me.
Dan says, "Excellent advice." So, uh, we also have a couple of comments in the chat that I'd like to let you know about.
Okay.
Christopher Damiano says complimenti, Chris. We also have
Ciao, Damiano.
John Tripolos. Excuse me if I mispronounced that. He said, "Great job, Christopher." We agree. And Moira Egan, hi Moira, who says, "Bravo, Sue, Christopher, great reading." Um, I
Wait,
agree. And
Damiano and Moira, sorry to interrupt you, Corey, are
yeah,
tuning in from Rome, I believe. And Moira has a new book called The Furies from LSU Press. What a good gang of poets we have here. So you should buy Moira's book too while you're at it. And then John Tripoulis is tuning in, I believe, from Athens, or maybe Ikaria from Greece.
um,
Thanks
we
for
really
being
have like
here.
we're a worldwide collection of people here. I want to talk about poetry. And speaking of all the poets here, I hope we get a couple of poet questions from the poets in the chat. So I'm looking at you, poets. I need some help here, but I want to
Be
start,
careful what you wish
honestly.
for, Corey.
Be careful. Yeah, that's a good point. I want to start with Dan, who says, you mentioned how one of your poems owed a debt to Heaney and another is in conversation with Lowell.
Mhm.
Um, can you talk a little about what draws you into the conversation with some of the major poets and poems from the canon?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I gave a reading last week in Georgia, and someone asked, what is your main source of inspiration? And I gave a really boring answer, I think, but it's the only answer for me. And the answer is reading. Um, and so I don't think okay, occasionally the world sends me an experience that's so profound that a poem follows it pretty quickly, but that's not usually the case. Almost always, I begin my poems as acts of reading that spill over onto the page and become acts of writing. Um, the audacity, on the other hand, so that's the general answer, Dan. But the audacity, on the other hand, to try to have a conversation with a poet, say as great as Lowell or Heaney, that might just be stupidity, but it's also a way of maybe honoring the poetic family that you feel like you assemble over the course of a lifetime of writing. And so you do it with great humility, I think, but also taking the lead from poets like that can be a great way into a poem. And so I think that's the best answer I can give. I should mention also that in addition to American poets, so much of this book is saturated by the work of Greek poets. Yanis Ritsos, Yorgos Seferis. There's a sequence of Days of poems. Those are inspired by the Greek poet Cavafy. So those Greek poets are also singing to me all the time, and I think that echo chamber um, ends up resounding in me and making its way to the page.
I I have a couple of comments here in the chat. Deal Edwards says, making the mundane into the mythic, which I think is a fun way to think about inspiration. And Damiano wanted to clarify that he is in Rome, but Moira is actually tuning in from San Pedro Sula, Honduras. So welcome, Moira.
Even
Um,
sexier. I mean, nothing sexier than Rome, but I'm sorry that you're not together, Damiano and Moira, but hello to both of you. And thanks for that comment, Deal.
I also wanted to welcome Haley for tuning in, who says, love the book and the reading.
Thanks,
Thank
Haley.
you for tuning in, Haley. I wanted to talk a little bit more about craft, and it looks like we got a couple of new questions about that. So, John, I'm going to get back to you in just a minute, but we're going to start with a couple of these craft questions. So, I'm going to start with Moira here. Moira wants you to talk about your relationship to ye old iambic pentameter, please.
Okay,
Moira says she was hearing some Ted Hughes and Crow in there, and she means that as a compliment.
great. Well, I'll take it as a compliment. And I think that and there probably is some Crow in there. Though I haven't read Hughes for a long time, but I'm sure it still lives in me. Well, my relationship to the decasyllabic line, but also the iambic pentameter line, started back in graduate school. Actually, Moira and I both studied with a poet named Derek Walcott, um, who did the cruel thing of making us write one-act plays in iambic pentameter and really live in iambic pentameter for an entire semester. Um, and I think it became the rhythm of how I would walk even through Harlem. But it became, I think, after those years, also the starting point for many of my poems. I think most of my poems in draft form kind of arrive on the page in a 10 syllable line. They look like blank verse. Often they don't end up looking like that in later drafts. But I mean, that is the breathing line of English poetry for the last 500-600 years. And so it's not a bad line to have, or a bad impulse to have banging around your head. Um, so my relationship to the 10 syllable line is I'm addicted to it, I think would be the best, probably the best answer. Thanks in part to working with Derek. But I'm by no means a dogmatist when it comes to my formalism. A lot of the poems in this book are in free verse. A lot of the surfaces that might have come out in 10 syllable units end up being really roughed up and worked into different shapes and poured into different vessels later on. Thanks for the question, Moira. You were there.
I uh, I have another question that's on a similar note. But before I ask it, I want to make one more apology to everyone tuning in from the Greek diaspora for just not knowing how to pronounce these names. So my apologies. But I want to ask a
You've done
question.
really well actually with all the
Okay,
names you've pronounced so far. You
well, now I'm gonna mess up because I'd like to ask a question from Adrian Kalfopoulou
Kalfopoulou.
Kalfopoulou. Yeah, and okay.
Tuning in
Adrian
from
asks.
Athens, I would guess. Yeah.
Um, Adrian wants to say that they love the poem about the refugees and was wondering if it was a poem inspired by news updates. It was haunting and felt very much like you were channeling some Severus or Severus.
For sure, for sure, Safaris is in that poem, and for sure, the news updates are in that poem. One of the things that you should know about Edrin Kalfopoulou and Alicia Stallings, and people who live in Athens, is that they did a lot of volunteer work, actually working with refugees from the migrant crisis. I don't live in Greece, and so I couldn't be there and didn't see much of this firsthand. But I do spend my summers in Greece and remember very vividly feeling the irony of going there voluntarily while other human beings were on the run and trying to get to Greece involuntarily. And if that doesn't trigger a kind of moral impulse in you to look in the mirror and think about those things, nothing will. And so that certainly makes it into the poem as well. I actually think more than news reports, Adrienne, it was hearing about the work you were doing and hearing about the stories you were telling that led to the genesis of that poem as much as anything else.
Thank you for that. A couple more comments in the chat that I'd like to relate to you, Christopher. Let's see here. Yeah, we had a couple answers to your last question. Um, Dan said that that was an excellent answer and audacious, but you earn your place in the conversation with those writers. And
Thank you, Dan.
Deal had a kind of a follow-up question that they wanted to know if you ever visited Jack Gilbert's hut.
In fact, I tried. There's a poem in the book called Monolithos, which is not only the title of Jack Gilbert's one of Jack Gilbert's excellent books, but it's also the title of a village in Santorini where he and the poet Linda Gregg lived for years. And in this poem, Monolithos, I'm not going to read it to you. You can buy the book and read it yourself. I actually went to Monolithos to try to find the hut and try to find their house. I have enough Greek that I could ask around the village to the older people who were there to see if anyone remembered these two American poets who lived here in the late 60s, early 70s. Um, I shouldn't probably spoil the poem, but the answer is not a single person remembered them ever even being there. And though I tried to reach out to Linda Gregg while she was still alive, to kind of get some locations, is it behind the rock, over the rock? Monolithos means one stone. I never successfully found where they lived. So they are still there, breathing in the landscape and in poetry, but there's no relics of them whatsoever. Um, Thanks, Deal in Meadville, Pennsylvania.
I'd like to stay on the subject of Greece,
Yeah.
first by sending along congratulations from Maria Patasi, who is
Oh
an
my
old
gosh.
student of yours from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, currently tuning in from
Bravo.
Greece.
Amazing.
And
Wonderful.
they said travel well in Greek, which I do not know how to say.
Kalotaksidi.
That's right. Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank
Maria.
you so much for tuning in, Maria. And also, I'd like to pass along a comment from Mimi Seyfirth, who says, congratulations on your new book, Christopher, from a fellow Phil Holland from Washington, D.C. I especially love your poem about the Mani, an area in Greece for which I have a special affection.
Good. Mimi also follows the exploits and travels of Patrick Lee Fermer, probably the greatest prose stylist of the 20th century. I'll say boldly. Okay, Nabokov, we can fight about it, whatever. But she actually takes tours and follows sort of the paths of Patrick Lee Fermer, and so maybe that's my Patty poem for sure. And I'm glad that you picked up on that.
This is a comment from Dan. Dan says, fellow decasyllabic line addict here. That was hard to say.
Good. I don't know what the withdrawal symptoms are from that addiction, but hopefully they don't hurt too much.
I'd actually like to return to a question that was asked a couple minutes ago by John Tripoulas.
John
Um,
Tripoulas.
John Tripoulas. John, sorry for delaying your question, but John would like you to say a couple words about your second home, Thasos Island.
Yeah. Oh, it really is a second home. I have there's a family there. My Greek brother Tassos of Thasos, who's the one who's shooting the ram in the title poem, and also his parents and his wife and their kids. Um, it, First, I want to say I'm entirely honored. It doesn't make any sense that I would have a family that lives on a tiny peninsula on a tiny island in a very remote region of Greece. But as I said earlier, I'm glad it happened to me. I went to Thasos for the first time in I think 1993. I took my motorcycle there for a weekend. Um, and unlike most Greek islands, which are typically pretty barren, not a lot of trees, Thasos is incredibly green. It's this beautiful round island with a mountain on top. And I was there in my first hour, I circumnavigated the entire island on my motorcycle. Um, and if you had told me I was in Greece, I might not have believed it because I felt like I was in Wisconsin. Pine forests. I mean, if you looked this way, that is to the right, You had pine forests and bubbling brooks and this wonderful Wisconsin-like landscape. But of course, if you looked the other direction, you had the Aegean, and this spectacular, some of those beautiful water in the country. And so I think probably from one of the reasons that that island chose me and I chose that island is because of the resemblance for me or the memory in me of the way these two landscapes talk to one another. Um, so John, that's the quick answer to why Thasos for me. It just happened, and I'm lucky for it.
I feel like that brings us to like a full circle moment, talking about sort of the origin and the kind of driving force of your book. So I did want to talk a little bit about uh, theology. Like I think I just think theology functions obviously as one of the anchors of this book,
Mhm.
um, and also in interesting ways. We have theology from animals, we have theology from places, and the thing that I found interesting and striking was that this theology is sometimes silly, but they're also prayers. Is that right?
That's absolutely the case. One of the first of those theology poems I wrote is a poem called Theology in Negril, a place in Jamaica, and thinking about what is sacred there. And that poem opens, if I had not forgotten how to pray, I might have spoken, Lord of Smoke. Um, and I think I I was raised in organized religion, but broke up with it when I was about 16 years old. And but the I think the structures and rhythms and mechanisms of a devotional life still remain somehow hardwired in my DNA, even though I'm kind of a lapsed Lutheran, Buddhist, Rastafarian, something or other. I'm not really any of those things. Um, but but I think that the relation between poetry and prayer is also very important. And I think these were attempts for me to find my way back to a devotional kind of utterance, but one that allows for a lot of doubt and skepticism and playfulness, and maybe doesn't take itself too seriously. So using those acts of ventriloquism probably helped me do that in a way that didn't make me feel too self-conscious.
It's interesting to me that you say utterance because it's such an experience hearing your poetry be read aloud, and it really just it animates, and it gives a different dimension to it. I think for some people, it's not a different experience, but for me, it was a really different experience reading your poems versus hearing them spoken. But I like that kind of sense that you use utterance there because I don't think you meant it spoken, but
Mhm.
that really translated for me that way.
Thank you. Thank you. I do think there's something different about hearing the poem and then seeing it on the page. A good example is that last poem, Turning 50 at the Oracle of Death, happens to be 10 stanzas of 5 lines each. And if you were paying attention to the poem, the 5 and 10 and the number 50 not only takes over the shape of the poem, but is in fact part of its architecture. But you wouldn't know that unless you were looking at the page necessarily.
I want to pass along a couple more comments
Please.
from the chat, and then I think I might ask a final question. We can
Okay.
go about our afternoon or evening, depending on where you're tuning in. Moira, thank you so much. Moira says, Christopher and Corey, thanks so much for a wonderful launch. Thank you for
Thank you.
tuning in all the way from Honduras, Moira. We appreciate it. And John Triple S says, Kalo Taxido in Greek means may your book travel well. Also, you can view the Holy Mountain from Thasos Island. It's a few miles nearby.
That's true. In fact, the balcony where I run a summer writing workshop there. It's called Writing Workshops in Greece. Good good.com to nab. But every night as we sit and drink our wine and finish up our poetry readings, what we actually look at across the three beaches is the outline of Mount Athos right there in the distance. So you're right, John. The proximity of Thasos to that holy place is also something that drew me there for sure.
We're getting to that place, and I'm going to ask you an ending question. But
Beautiful.
before I do want to thank everyone for tuning in. And I want to remind everyone that there is a 40% off code in the chat. It should be pinned, but if not, you can scroll all the way up to the top and see it. So make sure to get a copy of this book if you haven't yet, and to write down that code if you plan on buying it later, because yeah. makes it a lot more affordable. Um, so yeah, Christopher, before we go, I just want to ask, this book is out in the world, and where are we headed next? Like, what are we writing? What's the next collection that you're working on?
That's
If
great. I
not
really
something else.
appreciate it. And just let me reiterate your thanks to everyone. What beautiful conglomeration of friends from across the world were here today. I thank you all for tuning in. Um, I am writing in miniature these days. And one of the great things about having a new book out in the world is that suddenly the book exists, but then the cisterns are empty. I just did a residency at a great place called VCCA and wrote 8 poems in 2.5 days, which is an incredibly fast pace for me. I write about 1 poem a year typically. But I'm writing these little poems. All of them are consist of a single sentence, and so I let the poem run for up to 14 lines. Many of them are coming out in the shape of a sonnet-like something. But they're little poems in miniature that try to capture one moment of consciousness or ethical thought. And those are the poems being given to me right now. I don't know what they're going to be yet, but bring me those little poems, muses, and I will continue taking dictation, and then we'll see what it adds up to.
Thank you, Christopher.
Thank
Um,
you.
Thank you, everyone, again for tuning in. And reminder that our next book launch is going to be next Thursday, February 12th, and we'll be discussing Uncivil Guard with Foster Chamberlain. So if you're around, please tune in. Anything else before we sign off, Christopher?
Just thanks again to you, Corey, and to everyone for being here.
All right. Ciao. Thank you, everyone.